Good morning and welcome to Begin in the Word. Today we're going to begin a study on the book of Galatians. In this series of studies, we'll go through the book of Galatians verse by verse. Since Galatians is 6 chapters long, that will take a considerable amount of time. In this particular stretch of our studies, we'll just be looking at the earlier parts of the book of Galatians as well as an introduction to the book. Speaking of an introduction to the book, that is the subject of our study today. Let's look now in Galatians chapter 1, the first two verses. Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are with me, to the churches of Galatia. Here we find that the Galatian letter, as is suggested by its name, is addressed to the churches or a group of congregations in the region of Galatia. Now, in first century Rome, the name or title Galatia was used in a couple of different senses. Number one, there was a province, a Roman province by the name of Galatia, and that province was in Central Asia Minor, or the region of what today is called Turkey. But Galatia was also an ethnic region. That name is derived from the Gauls, or the ancient people who had populated that area years earlier. And so outside the borders of the province itself, there were others who were considered Gauls ethnically, or who were considered Galatians, or their areas were part of the region considered Galatia, even though it might not be in the province that bore that name. So there's two senses then, a more narrow sense of the term Galatia, meaning only the Roman province, and then the broader sense that encompassed other provinces that were ethnically Galatian in their population. And as you might guess, my understanding, at least from history, is the borders of that province often adjusted through Roman history in accommodation of the broader ethnic sense of the term. So when we look for the commencement of the gospel work in that, we don't have to narrow our attention only to the province. We can look in a broader sense to the region of Central Asia Minor. And when we do, we find work beginning there in Acts chapter 14, the first 6 verses, where Paul and company went to Iconium. And then from Iconium, Paul went to Lystra, also a part of that region, in Acts 14, verse 6 through 20. You might recall that it was at Lystra that Paul was stoned and thought dead. And because of that controversy that centered around Paul, he had to flee. And so he fled to Derbe, another city or town in that general region of Galatia. And we read about Paul's work there in Acts 14, verse 21 through 22. Now, when we continue following Paul's work, we find he later returned to the region of Galatia in Acts 16, the first 5 verses. And if you're acquainted with the New Testament, you remember that a work companion of Paul's was a young man named Timothy. And Acts 16 shows us that that is the point in time where Paul took Timothy under his wing and carried him with him to work with him and train with him in the gospel ministry. And of course, they became close companions and enjoyed somewhat of a father-son type relationship in their gospel work. So when you're reading in the New Testament and you encounter Timothy, or you think about Timothy, or the 2 letters written to Timothy, you might recall that Timothy was originally from the general region of Galatia and a product of Paul's work there. In Acts 16 and verse 6, he mentions Paul preaching at Galatia. Now, this wouldn't have been the first time of his preaching at Galatia, because when we think of that more general region, we call to mind his work at Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe that happened earlier in Acts. So Acts 16 and 6 was just a continuation of work that Paul had commenced in that general area earlier. Then later on in Acts 18 and 23, we find Paul later returning to that region. And who knows what different towns may have been embraced by his work at that time. Now, with those comments made, we have a good idea of what congregations might have been the ones who would have received copies of this Galatian letter. Let's move forward then with the question of when the epistle was written. Turning our attention now to Galatians 4 and 13, he said, "You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at the first." So here Paul speaks of his initial work of the gospel there in the region of Galatia. Well, we learned that that work originated in Acts chapter 14, the earliest part. So this epistle had to have come sometime after Acts 14, because it speaks of that early work in Galatia as something that had already happened. So the letter was sometime after Paul's initial work in that region. Now, how long after that initial work? Well, in Galatians 1 and 6, he said, "I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you to the grace of Christ to a different gospel." So here he speaks of the problem in the churches of that region, which is the subject of the epistle. He speaks of their problem as something that came very soon upon them after their conversion. So the letter appears to have come somewhat soon after their conversion to Christ. So that causes us to suspect that the Galatian letter was written sometime after Acts chapter 14, perhaps after Acts 16 and verse 6, but likely before that later trip we read about, or mentioned rather, in Acts chapter 18. So this is a letter that came shortly after Paul's work in that region, his initial work in that region, and that means it was one of Paul's first letters written. In fact, there are some scholars who would argue it was the first letter that the Apostle Paul wrote. If you want to assign a date to that, of course, such date assignments are approximate, but you could look in the latter part of the 40s AD up into the early 50s, somewhere in that region of time. Now, let's go back to Galatians 1 and talk about the theme of the epistle. He said in Galatians 1, beginning at verse 6, "I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him to call you to the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. Even so, if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed." Here Paul uses very strong language to describe the problems they were having in the early church there and the subject of his epistle. The problems involved them turning away from the truth of the gospel and some troubling them. And this troubling was a perversion of the gospel, a turning away. And Paul said, "Let those that trouble you be accursed." And he repeated that, "Let them be accursed." Very strong language to condemn these false teachers. So the letter deals with problems that the young congregations in that region were having. And those problems involved a perversion of the gospel. Well, exactly how were they corrupting the gospel? We can turn to Galatians 2 and find more information that speaks to that question. "Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took also Titus with me." Now here in Galatians 2 and verse 1, Paul connects the problems they were having at Galatia, about which he wrote the epistle, with problems that they were having at Jerusalem near the same time. And then he goes on and talks about this discussion in verses 3 on through 5 of Galatians 2. "Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And this occurred because of false brethren, who secretly brought in and came in by stealth to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us unto bondage, to whom we did not yield submission even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you." So in this reading, we understand that the problems they were having at Jerusalem, some kind of problems they were having in the region of Galatia, involved binding some to circumcision or bringing them into bondage to that discussion. And this was false brethren, people who were turning people away from the truth of the gospel. So the theme of the epistle then involved reasserting the truth of the gospel as opposed to this corruption of the gospel. And it's a problem that was connected to the discussion at Jerusalem, and it was a problem that involved insisting on some being circumcised. So understand This is not about people having an honest discussion, that might have said, well, God asked Abraham and his family to practice circumcision. Is that something he expects of Christians today? It wasn't an honest discussion at all like that, but it was false brethren who were troubling the church, as we read earlier. So this was something that was bringing them into bondage, something that was binding or requiring circumcision. And this inclusion of false brethren tells us it was more than just an honest discussion. And it was bringing into bondage. It was requiring something that God did not require. Turning our attention to Galatians 3, the first two verses, he talks about them being bewitched. And he talks about them being brought to the works of the law in the argumentation that he makes to correct their error. So this problem of binding circumcision evidently also involved binding Moses' law. And when you think about that and you think about problems they were having at Jerusalem, that brings our minds back to Acts 15. The first two verses there, it says, certain men came in from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Therefore, Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them. They determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. So we find Paul and his companions going to Jerusalem to discuss a problem of people binding circumcision and binding other things that were customs of the law of Moses. And apparently these false teachers had made their way into the region of Galatia, and their ideas had spread there. So this was a problem that they had discussed at Jerusalem, and it was a problem that had spread to the region of Galatia. And we find that problem dealt with in Acts chapter 15, and we find that problem dealt with in the letter to the Galatians. Now, this concludes our introductory study to the book of Galatians, and this study will help inform our approach to the book when we study it verse by verse in future studies. And I hope and pray that this introduction will help provide clarity to our future studies. Thank you so much for joining us for today's study here at Beginning the Word. And as we've begun today in the Word, it is our prayer that you'll live out today and every day in the mighty Word of God.